You guys have been wrestling with this heavy question, and your stack of readings, including How Democracies Die, shows just how deep you're willing to go. Let's face it, it's a pretty unnerving topic. But knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. And what's so gripping about this book is that it flips the script on how we typically think about democratic collapses. We often picture traumatic coups or violent revolutions, but Levitsky and Ziblatt, these Harvard political scientists, they argue that the road to ruin can be much quieter, even legal.
It's almost like a political thriller, right? These elected leaders, they come to power promising the world, but then they start chipping away at the very system that got them there.
Yeah.
It's subtle, insidious, and frankly terrifying.
It is. And their central argument is a real wake-up call. Even countries with strong democratic traditions like the U.S. are vulnerable to this slow creeping death. They aren't immune to those who would exploit the system from within.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The book outlines two main paths to democratic death. The first is the classic dramatic takeover, the stuff of history books and Hollywood movies, coups, revolutions, the whole shebang.
Right. But the second path, that's where things get really interesting and perhaps more relevant to what we see happening around the world today. It's the electoral route, where leaders are elected democratically, but then gradually subvert the system from within, often with the support of a significant portion of the population.
So it's not always about tanks rolling down the street, but about seemingly good path, politicians slowly eroding democratic norms and institutions, often legally and with popular support.
Exactly. And one of the most chilling points the authors make is that this path to democratic death is often paved with good intentions. Leaders might justify their actions as necessary to combat corruption, restore order, or protect national security, all while gradually concentrating power and undermining checks and balances.
It's a wolf in sheep's clothing, using the very tools of democracy to dismantle it. So how do we spot these wolves? How do we know if a leader is genuinely committed to democratic principles, or if they're just paying lip service while plotting to dismantle the system?
That's where the book's 4 behavioral red flags come in. These are warning signs, almost like a political early warning system that can help us identify leaders with authoritarian tendencies. They're not foolproof, but they provide a framework for evaluating political behavior.
Okay, hit me with those red flags. I'm ready to take notes and start looking for them in my own corner of the world.
The first, and perhaps most glaring red flag, is the rejection of democratic rules of the game. This could manifest in refusing to accept credible election results, undermining the legitimacy of the electoral process, or suggesting that violence might be justified to achieve political goals.
Wow, that's pretty stark. I mean, questioning election integrity or condoning violence, those are serious breaches of democratic norms. What's the second red flag?
The second is denying the legitimacy of political opponents. This goes beyond simply disagreeing with your rivals on policy issues. It's about demonizing them, portraying them not as competitors, but as existential threats to the nation, enemies of the people.
So instead of engaging in healthy debate, they try to silence their opponents and delegitimize any criticism. That sounds awfully familiar. What's next?
The third red flag is tolerating or encouraging violence. This could involve explicit calls for violence against opponents, or, more subtly, failing to condemn acts of violence committed by their supporters, essentially. They create a climate where violence becomes an acceptable tool for political ends.
That's scary. It's like they're creating a permission structure for violence, even if they don't explicitly endorse it. And the final red flag.
The fourth red flag is a readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents and critics. This can include things like threatening to jail political rivals, trying to muzzle the press, or cracking down on dissent in the name of national security or public order.
So it's about suppressing any voices that challenge their authority, even if it means violating basic freedoms. It's a pretty clear sign that they're more interested in power than in protecting democratic values.
Exactly. And what makes these red flags so chilling is that Levitsky and Ziblatt found historical examples of leaders who displayed one or two of these tendencies. But what's alarming is when a leader hits all 4. And in recent history, they argue that Donald Trump was the first U.S. president to check all 4 boxes.
Okay, that's a bit unsettling to say the least. But it also raises an important question. Trump didn't just emerge out of thin air. How do these would-be autocrats gain power in the first place? Is it just charisma? Or is there something deeper at play?
There's definitely more to it than just charisma. The book delves into what they call fateful alliances. This is where established political parties and elites, often driven by fear or desperation, make a deal with the devil, so to speak. They form alliances with these outsider figures, thinking they can control them and exploit their popularity for their own gain.
So it's like a Faustian bargain. They think they can use these outsiders to achieve their own goals.
Yeah.
But they underestimate the danger they pose to the democratic system.
Precisely. And the book uses a chilling historical example to illustrate this dynamic. The rise of Benito Mussolini in Italy. You're probably familiar with Mussolini.
Yeah.
The notorious fascist dictator.
Oh, absolutely. A textbook example of 20th century authoritarianism. But I'm guessing there's more to the story than just his rise to power.
There is. What's fascinating is that Mussolini's fascist black shirts weren't actually that powerful at first. It was the Italian elites, the established political parties, who paved the way for his rise. They were facing economic crisis, social unrest, and the rise of communism.
Right.
And they were terrified. They saw Mussolini as a strong man who could restore order and crush the left. So they formed an alliance with him, thinking they could control him.
It sounds like they grossly underestimated him. What happened next?
Well, as history shows, they were tragically wrong. Once in power, Mussolini consolidated control, dismantled democratic institutions, and established a brutal dictatorship that lasted for over 2 decades. He outmaneuvered the elites who thought they could control him, and Italy paid a heavy price for their miscalculation.
It's a cautionary tale
Go?
that speaks directly to the dangers of these fateful alliances. It's a reminder that even in seemingly stable democracies, established political actors can become unwitting accomplices in their own demise. And that leads to a very unsettling question. Could something similar happen in other countries? Even in a country like the United States, with its long tradition of democratic values and institutions?
That's the question that Levitsky and Ziblatt force us to confront. They argue that the same dynamics that allowed Mussolini to rise to power in Italy are present in other democracies today, including the U.S. And they warn that when elites become too complacent, too willing to compromise democratic principles for short-term gains, they risk opening the door to authoritarianism.
It's chilling to think that even in countries like the U.S., with its seemingly robust democracy, those same patterns could emerge.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a constitution, checks and balances, all those safeguards, right?
You're right, the U.S. does have these institutional safeguards, but here's where it gets really interesting. The book argues that even the most meticulously crafted constitution can't fully protect a democracy. They call these safeguards hard guardrails, and they're essential, but they're not enough.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
What's missing? What else do we need besides a solid constitution?
Think of it this way. Imagine a pickup basketball game. No refs, just a bunch of people playing for fun. Even without official rules, there's an understanding of fair play, right? You don't intentionally trip someone, even if there's no rule explicitly against it.
Yeah, it's just understood. Like an unspoken code of conduct. You don't want to ruin the game for everyone.
Exactly. And in a democracy, those unspoken rules, those unwritten norms of behavior are just as important as the formal rules. They're like soft guardrails that keep things from getting out of control, that ensure power is exercised responsibly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. So what are some of the most crucial soft guardrails in a democracy? What should we be on the lookout for?
Levitsky and Ziblatt highlight two that are absolutely essential: mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. These norms are like the oil that keeps the democratic machine running smoothly.
Okay, those sound pretty academic. Can you break them down for me? Explain what they mean in practice.
Absolutely. Mutual toleration means accepting your political opponents as legitimate rivals, even if you disagree with them vehemently. It's about recognizing that they have an equal right to exist, to compete for power, and to govern if they win fairly.
So it's about seeing your opponents as fellow citizens, not as enemies of the state, even when their views are completely different from your own.
Precisely. It's about respecting their right to hold different views, to express those views freely, and to participate in the political process without fear of reprisal. It's about disagreeing without demonizing, debating without destroying.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about this institutional forbearance idea? What does that look like in practice?
Institutional forbearance is about showing restraint in using your institutional power, even if it's technically legal, if it might damage the democratic system in the long run. It's about thinking beyond your immediate self-interest and considering the health of the democracy as a whole.
So it's about recognizing that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. It's about putting the long-term good of the system above short-term political gain.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Imagine a president who really wants to push through a controversial policy. They have enough votes in Congress, and they could technically ram it through, but they know it would deeply divide the country and undermine trust in the system. Practicing institutional forbearance would mean choosing not to exercise that power, even if it meant sacrificing a political win.
That's a really powerful example. It shows how these soft guardrails require a certain level of self-restraint, a commitment to something bigger than just winning the next election.
Right.
But the question is, are these norms really that fragile? Can they really erode to the point where a democracy is in danger?
Unfortunately, history shows us that they absolutely can. Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that these norms have been eroding in the U.S. for decades, starting in the 1980s and accelerating in recent years. And they point to several specific examples of how these guardrails have been weakened.
So this isn't just some abstract theory. There are real-world examples of how these norms have been violated in the U.S.
Absolutely. They point to the impeachment of Bill Clinton in the 1990s, which they argue was driven more by partisan animosity than by legitimate concerns about high crimes and misdemeanors. Then there was the rise of the birther movement, which questioned Barack Obama's legitimacy as president based on unfounded claims about his birthplace. These were clear examples of how political opponents were no longer seen as legitimate rivals, but as enemies to be destroyed.
It's disturbing to see how these tactics, which were once considered fringe or extreme, have become increasingly mainstream in recent years.
Exactly. And this erosion of norms has been fueled by several factors. One is the rise of hyper-partisan media outlets that profit from stoking outrage and division. These outlets often present distorted or misleading information, reinforcing existing biases and making it harder for people to have reasoned discussions about important issues.
So instead of informing the public and fostering a shared understanding of the facts, they're actually contributing to the polarization and distrust that are eroding our democracy.
That's right. And this is compounded by the rise of social media, which has created echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs. It's become harder and harder to have productive conversations across political divides when everyone is living in their own information bubble.
It's like we're speaking different languages, unable to communicate effectively or find common ground. And this polarization, this lack of mutual toleration, it doesn't just stay confined to the political sphere, does it?
Unfortunately, no. It spills over into everyday life. Families are divided, friendships are strained, and communities become fragmented along political lines. It's become almost impossible to have a civil conversation about politics without things getting heated and personal.
It's a toxic dynamic that's tearing at the fabric of our society. And you mentioned earlier that this erosion of norms has been accelerating in recent years. What's driving this acceleration? Is it just about politics and media, or are there deeper forces at play?
It's certainly a complex issue with multiple contributing factors, but Levitsky and Ziblatt point to another significant factor, what sociologists call status anxiety. This is the fear of losing your social status, your sense of identity, your place in the world.
So it's about feeling threatened by change, by the shifting demographics of the country, by the perceived loss of power and influence.
That's part of it. They argue that this anxiety is particularly acute among certain groups who feel like they're losing ground in a rapidly changing world. This can include white Americans who see their majority status declining as the country becomes more diverse, or working-class communities who feel left behind by globalization and economic change.
It's a sense of being forgotten, of being overlooked, of losing your voice in a world that seems to be passing you by.
Exactly. And this fear, this anxiety can make people more susceptible to the appeals of demagogues who offer simplistic solutions and scapegoat certain groups. These leaders exploit those fears, promising to restore a sense of order and security, often by targeting those who are perceived as different or threatening.
It's a dangerous game playing on people's fears and prejudices. And history shows us that it can have devastating consequences. But the question is, what can we do about it? How do we strengthen those soft guardrails and prevent our democracy from sliding further down this slippery slope?
That's the million-dollar question. And while there are no easy answers, How Democracies Die offers some important insights into how we can rebuild those norms and safeguard our democracy.
So we've been talking about these soft guardrails, these democratic norms that are so essential for a healthy democracy. But they're eroding, and it feels like things are getting worse, not better. What can we actually do to rebuild those guardrails and protect our democracy?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It can feel overwhelming, especially when we see those same patterns of democratic erosion playing out around the world. But the good news is that How Democracies Die doesn't just diagnose the problem. It also offers some potential solutions.
Okay, so let's get practical here. What are some concrete steps we can take as citizens to strengthen those democratic
Wow.
norms?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is hold our elected officials accountable for their behavior. We need to demand that they commit to upholding democratic norms even when it's politically inconvenient, and we need to be willing to call them out when they violate those norms.
So no more giving them a pass when they engage in divisive rhetoric or attack the legitimacy of their opponents. We need to make it clear that those kinds of behaviors are unacceptable regardless of which side of the aisle they're on.
Exactly. And it's not just about calling them out. It's about supporting candidates who demonstrate a commitment to democratic values, even if they don't perfectly align with our views on every issue.
hmm
We need to prioritize those values and make them a central part of our political discourse.
So it's about putting country over party, recognizing that the health of our democracy is more important than any one election or policy debate. But is that enough? I mean, individual actions can only go so far.
You're right. It's not just about individual actions, it's about collective effort. That's why it's so important to support organizations and institutions that are working to strengthen democracy.
Like what kinds of organizations?
Think about groups that promote civic education, protect voting rights, combat disinformation, and hold those in power accountable. These organizations play a vital role in defending our democracy and ensuring that it remains healthy and vibrant.
It sounds like they're doing the crucial work of rebuilding those soft guardrails, strengthening the very fabric of our democracy. And speaking of vital institutions, the book also talks about the importance of a free and independent press. Why is that so crucial?
Oh, a free press is absolutely essential for a functioning democracy. They act as watchdogs, holding those in power accountable and exposing corruption and abuse of power. They also play a critical role in informing the public, providing the information we need to make informed decisions about our government and our society.
It's like they're the eyes and ears of the people, keeping a watchful eye on those who wield power and ensuring that the truth gets out. But in today's world, with the rise of social media and the proliferation of misinformation, it feels harder than ever to know what to trust.
That's true. It's become increasingly difficult to navigate the information landscape and discern fact from fiction. But that's precisely why it's so important to support quality journalism and to develop our own media literacy skills.
So it's not just about blindly consuming information, but about being critical consumers, questioning what we read and hear, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Exactly. We need to be active participants in the information ecosystem, not passive recipients. And speaking of active participation, another crucial step in strengthening our democracy is engaging in constructive dialogue across political divides.
Oh, that's easier said than done, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, with all the polarization and animosity out there, it feels like people are more interested in shouting at each other than in having meaningful conversations.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's not impossible. We need to find ways to talk to each other, even when we disagree, without resorting to demonization or personal attacks. We need to listen to each other, try to understand where the other person is coming from, and find common ground.
It sounds like it requires a certain level of humility, a willingness to acknowledge that we might not have all the answers, that the other side might have valid points worth considering.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that we share a common destiny, and that we need to work together to solve the challenges facing our country. It's about rebuilding those bonds of community and shared citizenship that have been frayed by hyperpartisan politics.
And ultimately, isn't that what democracy is all about? It's about finding ways to live together, to govern ourselves, and to create a more just and equitable society, even when we disagree about the best way to get there.
Exactly. And while strengthening those democratic norms is crucial, we also need to address the underlying conditions that make people susceptible to the appeals of demagogues in the first place.
So it's not just about changing individual behavior, it's about addressing the systemic issues that create the fertile ground for authoritarianism to take root.
That's right. We need to advocate for policies that reduce inequality, promote economic opportunity, and ensure access to quality education and healthcare for all. These are the building blocks of a strong and vibrant democracy, and they're essential for creating a society where everyone feels like they have a stake in the system and a voice in their own governance.
Wow, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive. It's been sobering to learn about the ways democracies can crumble, but it's also been empowering to hear about the concrete steps we can take to protect our own democracy.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought from the book, How Democracies Die, reminds us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, constant vigilance, and a willingness to defend it against those who would undermine it.
So it's up to each and every one of us to be informed, engaged citizens, to hold our leaders accountable, and to work together to build a more just and equitable society.
That's the challenge and the opportunity before us. The fate of our democracy rests in our hands.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep